My name is Brittany Wright with Insight News, and I have had the honor and the privilege of hosting this virtual town hall series for a good chunk of 2020, a year that has been so completely unprecedented and unique in so many ways. And so on this final town hall series, this final Wednesday of the year before we go on vacation for the holiday, we felt like it was appropriate to bring on some journalists to help us just recap all of the highlights and the stories and the not so high points of this year, and to really process what it is that we've experienced and what we have to look forward to. Today, before we get started, I just want to say a special thank you to our sponsors, North Point Health and Wellness, Children's Minnesota, the Minnesota Spokesman Recorder, and Minnesota Community Care for making this town hall possible. Now, I am joined today by some of Minnesota's best and brightest journalists, independent storytellers, and leaders within their respective industries who have been keeping our communities informed and inspired. And so today on our panel, we have Miss Adrian Thornton, who is a nurse and infection preventionist with Children's Minnesota. Welcome back, Adrian. It is great to see you as always. Also joining us is Georgia Fort. Welcome back. Georgia is an independent storyteller and producer correspondent. She's been doing her thing in the Twin Cities. And we're going to talk about that independent journey a little bit more on the town hall. But Georgia, welcome back. It's great to have you here. Also joining us is Mr. Harry Colbert, who is the editor of North News. He used to sit in my seat and host this town hall series, and now he's over at North News doing great things. And so, Harry, I'd love to talk to you more in just a little bit about your transition and your evolution. But first and foremost, welcome back, welcome home, I should say, to the town hall.
It's
great
good
to
be
have
home.
you. We also have Charles Hallman, who is the reporter for the Spokesman Recorder, one of our community partners here within the Twin Cities, and someone who's done a lot of work within this industry as it relates to journalism and media. And without further ado, I think it's okay that we get started with our conversation. So, of course, we're still going to talk about COVID in just a little bit. But first, just to get us grounded and to hear everyone's voice, panelists, I want to ask you one by one, when you reflect back on 2020 and your particular role, whether it's as a journalist or as a professional within the medical industry, when you reflect back on this year, what is a story or a moment that you know that you'll absolutely never forget? And Adrian, I'll start with you.
So for me, the moment that I will never forget is the day that I was working at Children's Minneapolis. And I had my head buried in my computer. And my director called me on my cell phone and said, "You and whoever is out in the suite with you need to leave immediately because they're going to be rioting soon. And they are planned to come straight down Chicago Avenue. And so, for your safety, you need to leave and go home." And that is a day I will never forget because it just seemed so surreal at the time. You know, George Floyd dying was bad enough, but just that, for me, that kind of put me right in the middle of it. I was aware of it. I was involved in some of the recovery efforts, but that day I felt like I was right in the middle of what happened to him because now I'm being directly impacted and I'm having to very, very speedily pack up everything I can and go home. And she told us to plan to just work from home for the next few days until things could calm down. So that is something that I will never forget. The awareness that I got from that, I will carry with me for the rest of my life.
Absolutely. And we're going to get more into the murder of George Floyd and just the major transitions and shifts that we saw, especially within the Twin Cities community later on in our conversation. But to keep the opener going, I want to ask Harry next. What is something that you've experienced in 2020 as it relates to your role as a journalist that you will never forget?
As my role as a journalist, it kind of dovetails into George Floyd as well. But I was 2 weeks into the job as editor-in-chief of North News when George Floyd was killed. And up until that point, I was hired virtually, the same way we're on a virtual call now. That was how the hiring process went because everyone was quarantining. I had been quarantining since March diligently. And when the first vigil took place, that was my first time pretty much in 2 months being in a group of people. And it was surreal and also overwhelming because of the gravity of the situation, but also because we were in the midst of a pandemic. We knew far less then than we know now. And just being surrounded by that group of people, thousands of people down there, I felt very uncomfortable just being around humans again, to be honest.
Absolutely. We've been juggling with the rhetoric here on this town hall of, are we socially distant or are we just physically distant? And when you add in lots of people being in the house for the majority of the year, when those moments came up in which you were in the presence of other people, it did change the way in which we thought about social interaction, which in turn can impact the way that we feel about ourselves if we're not connected to our humanity. So absolutely understand that. And we'll continue to talk about more implications of the pandemic as we get deeper into this conversation. I'd like to pivot to Charles Hallman next. What's something, when you reflect on 2020 and your role as a journalist, what's something from this year that you'll just never forget?
Well, obviously the murder of George Floyd and the subsequent protests and things that happened after that will be always memorable. But I would go back a couple months before that when sports shut down, as suddenly as it did in March, something that had never been seen before since 9/11. And I thought that that was probably more memorable because when the NBA decided to shut down, that was a domino effect that led to everything else to shut down, college, prep, anybody. And I think that was a much more of an impact for me as a sports columnist because I never seen that before. Obviously, the George Floyd murder was more impactful as a journalist because I'm a Black man. And so therefore seeing those 9 minutes of video, only could tell me, well, that could have been me, that could have been one of my two sons, or either one of my sons or anybody else that I know that's Black and a male. So therefore, obviously that made a more of an impact. And, obviously could not separate myself from that story as a journalist because it affected me. And I could be objective as anybody else, but still would have I still have to report with a feeling of anger and a feeling of anguish and a feeling of what that would be me as well. So those are the moments that endeared and sit in my mind that'll stick forever.
Yeah, you bring up a great point that sports this year were the catalyst to the way in which our country dealt with a public health crisis, and you would think that there would be other people who were at the forefront of really taking this pandemic seriously, but it really did take these major sports institutions to make a first step in order for the rest of the country to kind of follow in a domino effect. Georgia, I want to ask you the same thing. What's something about 2020 and your role as a journalist that you'll just absolutely never forget when you reflect back on this year?
Yeah, absolutely. Brittany, I had to still go into work every single day through the pandemic. At the time, the company I was working for, considered media essential. And so I was still commuting into work physically every single day. And during those first few days after George Floyd's death, was getting little sleep because I was up watching a lot of the live streams until 2, 3, sometimes 4 o'clock in the morning, and then turning around, waking up, going to work. And I remember, I believe it was the morning after the precinct was set on fire, and there were these strings of stores being looted. And it just seemed like the unrest was nonstop overnight this particular morning. And so I had to go into work and was pretty comfortable with doing that. As a journalist, we sometimes are in really tense moments, whether it's a house fire, apartment fire, on scene of being on scene of a triple murder, a double homicide, you know, these kinds of things you're kind of used to. And so I tend to say that my safety barometer is very different than other people's. I don't tend to feel fear as easily as most folks. But this particular morning, I was watching a live stream at work, and the looting was, you know, carrying over into St. Paul. And I live on the east side, and I was like, oh, there's just no way that it's going to make its way over there. And I remember looking and seeing that there was looting that started happening at Sunray Mall, which is very near to my home, where my children are. Because of quarantining, my mother, who lives by herself, had come to stay with us. And, you know, I remember calling her at work, excusing myself from my desk, from my responsibilities, and saying, hey, I need a minute. And calling her and saying, hey, you guys really should leave and pack up and go to your house and, you know, take the kids there and stay there until this all calms down. And, you know, that night, having a very serious conversation with my husband, who felt compelled to go sit in his business now that this had, you know, traveled on into St. Paul. And, you know, he was like, I really can't afford for my business to be vandalized. And because I don't think he has any insurance on his place at the time. And so, you know, I just told him, I was like, hey, everything in that business can be replaced, but the things that are inside of this home cannot, meaning myself, our children, and, you know, just not feeling safe, not feeling comfortable. And I don't think that there's ever been a point in my career where I felt that way. And so I think that that will be a moment, that phone call to my mother, that conversation with my husband, those will be moments that I will never forget.
Absolutely. It makes me wonder, there's this reoccurring theme about what happened after George Floyd was murdered. His murder in itself and the documentation of it was horrific and gut-wrenching. And for anyone who watched the 8+ minutes of that video, you'll never forget that. You'll absolutely never forget that. And particularly as Black people within the Twin Cities, there was a particular ripple effect from the murder of George Floyd that people in other parts of the world maybe were replicating, but couldn't have possibly experienced in the same way that residents within the Twin Cities, especially Black residents, were experiencing it. So I'm curious for all of you, do you feel like the national coverage of George Floyd's murder and the uprising accurately reflected what was happening on the ground here in the Twin Cities?
I can go first. No, I don't think so. I think that they focus on just the area where George Floyd was murdered, and stayed focused on that, but never went and reached out into the communities like North Minneapolis, South Minneapolis, areas where the issues between police and community has been long standing. I think that they never pursued that story. That George Floyd was not the first time somebody got killed by police. Mm-hmm. It just was the first time that it was shown worldwide. And I think that the national media did not do a good job in reaching out and talking to communities in the aftermath. You know, after the disturbances, I hate to use the word riot, after the disturbances was finished, you know, they almost like they packed up their gear and went on to the next story.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. And I also don't use the word riot. I use uprising because that's what it was. But one of the things that a lot of the national media, and I get it because their job is to move in and move out. They have a specific skill set. But what they didn't do is they didn't understand that we were still fresh in our minds was our November 15th, 2015, July 6th, 2016, with the murders of Jamar Clark, Philando Castile. And so they couldn't necessarily have that as context as to understand why the killing of George Floyd was like the straw that broke the camel's back there. They didn't have that historical context. What Charles was saying about the North Side is very true. And it kind of echoes what Georgia was saying. I woke up on Thursday night was when a lot of the uprising was taking place down over near the 3rd precinct. Well, I live in North Minneapolis. I woke up to find out that North Minneapolis was on fire. And by on fire, 4 blocks from my house, a gas station was in flames at 5-something in the morning. And it was the most surreal thing to see flames shooting out of that gas station. The O'Reilly Auto Parts on Broadway Avenue still in flames. I'm not talking about fire put out in flames. It looked like a war zone. Cars crashed on top of one another on Broadway. It was the most surreal experience you could ever imagine seeing. It's the closest thing that I can imagine happens in what we consider war-torn countries.
I would agree with both of those sentiments about the way in which the media covered what was happening on the ground, or did not cover what was happening on the ground, and just how surreal the entire experience was. It was hard to think that, man, in 2020, we're still seeing this level of civil unrest and in a peculiar way, right? The 3rd precinct is in South Minneapolis, yet North Minneapolis was on fire. What is that even symbolic of? Harry, I see you have something else you want to add.
Yeah, because that's the other thing. And that's where I think we, and I'm going to put the onus on myself, we as journalists who are here, we need to continue to tell this story, and we will be telling the story, because at the end of the day, you looked at what was hit. Cub Food was hit. The gas stations and convenience stores that provided goods and services for our community were hit. They tried to hit North Market. Thankfully, they were stopped before they could really do serious damage to North Market. But you look at the institutions that were being hit, and it was like, why are they going for the things that would literally cut the people off from goods and services? And that's when the governor and the mayors of Minneapolis and St. Paul got on TV with those frantic announcements that white supremacists had infiltrated the movement, which is something that I was very well familiar with, because it happened in 2015 for sure, with the unrest after Jamar Clark's killing. But also, I'm from St. Louis, Missouri, and so I know the story of Ferguson very well. And when the Darren Wilson was not charged in the murder of Mike Brown, that night, similar events happened. And I watched and I said, that's not us.
That's not us. Yeah, that's exactly right. And I feel like there wasn't ever a very clear and concise narrative from any national media outlet on who exactly was behind so much of the looting and the setting a fire of burnings and assets, community assets that our community members deeply depended on. And one of the beautiful things that came out of this horrific experience was that community banded together and really showed up, and that the local journalists that were on the ground, especially those within Black institutions, or that really had an intentional effort to center the narrative and lived experience of BIPOC communities, they were able to tell those stories and to disseminate information so that mutual aid and community support could show up and happen the way that it was supposed to. But I'm curious, especially for Charles and Harry, do you think that this moment, the long-term ripple effect of the murder of George Floyd, is going to change the way that popular media talks to and talks about Black men? I ask that because we saw after George Floyd was killed, similar to the way that certain corporations responded to the pandemic, all of a sudden there were all of these emails that were coming out and commercials that were being produced, and all of this messaging of, we stand with the movement for Black lives and we must take a stand for something or will fall for anything. All of this social justice rhetoric that seemed relatively new for these corporations, yet that's been a consistent mantra within the Black community. It's like someday, for whatever reason, these corporations, when they saw George Floyd murdered, realized that Black lives do in fact matter, and that our humanity is something that they have to be intentional about centering. So I'll ask again, do you think that we're actually going to see a real shift in popular media for the way that we talk to and talk about Black men?
I'm an old skeptic and a pessimist, and I don't think so. And because until Black men are seen as human beings and not threats, I think that that becomes just a flavor of the month until they can move on to something else. I mean, look at how much the so-called racial awakening took place over the summertime, and then when it got fall, we don't hear anything anymore. You had corporations talking about Black Lives Matter, and they're going to do this, and they're going to do that, and then all of a sudden you don't hear about that anymore. So, and so I don't think that, you know, we as Black men has yet to been seen as humans. And George Floyd showed that clearly. And when you see the face of the officer's knee and you see his face, that shows that he had no humanity in him and saw Mr. Floyd as a human being. So I don't think so. I think that we still have a running battle. And even though there's a change in the presidency, I still don't see that happening. Might be a little bit better, but I just see that we have been fighting this for over 200, maybe 400 years. We've been fighting this image of we're being a threat, more so than Black women, because Black men was used in a different context to support slavery and those type of things. But Black men was always seen as a threat, always seen as if we had a chance to come back at you, we're going to come back to you with a vengeance. And so therefore, the long story short, no, I don't see a lasting, I don't see a change. I see that right now is the flavor of the month. And once you get the flavor of the month, you find another flavor, you move on.
Absolutely. Harry, what are your thoughts?
So like Charles, I also am a skeptic, but I am an optimist. I'm also a realist. The reality is Black lives will matter as long as we as Black people keep reminding others that Black lives matter. Yeah, we're the flavor of the month, but we get to decide how long, how many days are in this month. At the end of the day, it is incumbent upon us to keep our foot on the pedal, and everything that we want, we need to demand now, because now is the time where people actually, whether it's because of their benevolence or because of them looking out for a bottom line, whatever the reason is, they are recognizing that something has to change. When you look at the coverage and the portrayal, you look just last week, MSNBC announced the new president is going to be a Black woman. Other national news organizations are starting to announce changes in leadership, not just the reporters on the ground, but in the leadership structure. And that's where true change is happening. My hometown of St. Louis, KSDK, person who started with them, Art Holiday, who started as a sports reporter, was just named 2 days ago as the news director of KSDK. First Black news director probably in the market. I know for sure in that station. But so I'm seeing change. But the issue is, if the change isn't lasting, real talk, it's on us. Because right now, I tell people, at this moment, we need to be asking for the moon. And I'm telling you, the people who are the powers that be will go back into their boardrooms and say, thank God he didn't say Pluto.
That's right. Nope, you're absolutely right. And we are seeing shifts in representation in the media. You know, the Biden-Harris administration just announced an all-female senior communications team, and that's the first time that that's ever existed. And so as we think about the incoming administration and the way in which our news as it relates to our federal policies will be delivered will be primarily from women. That's also a shift that we've seen. And Charles brought up a really important dynamic about the way in which Black men are presented in the media versus Black women. So I want to pivot to Georgia and ask, we've talked a lot about George Floyd in this conversation. And obviously, you know, as residents of the Twin Cities, you know, his murder happened right in our backyard and it hit really close to home. But I'm curious, I didn't feel like Breonna Taylor's murder was talked about nearly as much as George Floyd's murder, although they're relatively similar in nature. And I'm wondering, why do you think that is? And what specifically is the plight of the Black woman when it comes to representation in media?
Well, I would say I think part of the reason why George Floyd's murder was discussed more was because of the video, you know, and so just those grueling, you know, 9 minutes that everyone was able to actually sit and witness, and we have seen that instant access to footage. It almost, the immediate response is outrage, and so I think that's, and it makes a case high profile, right? And so when you look at Philando Castile, his murder being streamed live on Facebook by Diamond Reynolds, there was immediate outrage to people being able to see that. And so unfortunately, what ends up happening when there is not instant access to footage is the officers, the police department, they have an opportunity to kind of spin that narrative, in my opinion, to fit whatever excuse, you know, I feared for my life, they had a weapon. And we saw that same very thing happen with the PIO here in Minneapolis. The very first press release, if you go back and look, it's still out there in the archive. The very first press release that the Minneapolis Police Department issued said that a man died due to medical complications during an arrest, when we know that's actually not what happened. And so with those specific instances, I think video played a huge role. But overall, yeah, I mean, there are dozens of Black women. There's thousands of Indigenous women who, you know, go missing, who are murdered. And there's not this, you know, huge public outcry in the same way. And so I can't say exactly what it is, but I do know that in our society, you know, patriarchy has played a role in shaping the dynamics of our community, of our society. And, you know, when you look at even the wage gap between men and women. And so we know that the things that are holding the Black community back are the systems of oppression, which divide people by race, which divide our humanity by gender, and says, you know, this is more valuable than that. And unfortunately, it despite the fact that we are life givers, has equated us to be less than. And so, you know, I think that every time when we are operating in the system that was designed by white supremacy, we're going to continue to see less representation of women and less representation of people of color. And the stories in terms of media that are going to continue to go to the forefront are going to be stories of white men and white women. And we know that when you look at the numbers, 80% of people who are interviewed on mainstream media are white men. And so they're going to continue to amplify their narrative and their priorities and their agenda.
Absolutely. And when you talk about systems that were built off of white supremacy, we see the evidence and the historical context of a community's distrust in policing, given its historical nature. We also see that when it comes to medical distrust as well. And being in a pandemic, there's been so much conversation within the Black community in particular about how we're going to navigate COVID. We're disproportionately impacted by it. But there was a recent poll by the Kaiser Foundation that said over 30% of the Black population is still unsure on whether or not they're even willing to take a vaccine as it relates to preventing themselves from contracting COVID-19. And so I'm curious from Adrienne, given the historical context of Black bodies within the medical system. Now that we're at this point where there is a vaccine that has been approved and that is being disseminated around the country, do you think that our community is ready to buy in to this type of COVID response?
You know, I don't think we are. I've talked to several people over the last few weeks. There is still a lot of distrust, a lot of feelings that Black people are being used as someone termed it, a guinea pig for the vaccines, and that just isn't true. But I think where we failed is we have not done enough to communicate and educate and inform the community so that they could make an informed decision and hopefully come to the decision to get the vaccine. You know, the information is out there, the vaccine is safe. The process of developing it did not change. A lot of people feel like, oh, well, it happened too fast and it's more related to politics than what's best for the country, but that isn't true. The process for developing them and bringing them to market did not change. What changed is the mindset of those with the money, and they put the money, the government put money into the process to get these vaccines to market quicker. We had people volunteering to be in vaccine trials, which is really unusual. Usually with any type of medical trial, you have to go out and recruit to get people to participate, and it takes some time. And with the COVID vaccine, they didn't have to take that time because people were looking for ways to volunteer to participate in the trials. So we were able to get the thousands of people in the trial that we needed at a much quicker rate. They were actually able to do the science to develop the vaccine because they had the resources to do it. And so the only thing that changed was the approval process, because the vaccine is not approved for general use. It is approved for emergency use, and that's just a different process. They still look at the science, they look at the efficacy, they look at the safety of the vaccine, and they will not issue emergency use if it is not safe and effective, and it has to meet certain parameters. And so I think going forward, what we're going to have to do is be very intentional about going out to our community and talking to people and giving them the information they need so that they can really make a decision based on the science and not based on their fears or apprehension. And the fear and the apprehension is not going to go away. We're not telling people, oh, you should just forget about that. Don't think about it. Let it go. That's not what we're saying. We're saying be fearful, ask questions. If you don't get the answers you want, continue to ask questions, but make an informed decision based on science and not on your fear and not based on history, because things have really changed since our history, like the Tuskegee experiment. Doing trials with human subjects, there are so many safety measures put in place to protect people from being taken advantage of. Those safety measures were not in place historically, and so it's a very different time, and we just need to let the community know that and explain it to them so they understand and they can make a decision that's informative and not based on fear.
Well, it is most definitely a different world, but it's hard for people to really feel that and see that and trust in a vaccine, because America is functioning a little bit differently than other parts of the world as it relates to the treatment of this pandemic in general. There are places in the world that have 0 cases. You know, meanwhile, we have more people dying every day from COVID than we did during 9/11, right? And so I'm curious from you if you agree with the way in which we've handled COVID-19 in this country, and if you think that we'll get to a place where we're back at 0 cases.
I think we could have done a better job at having a national effort towards handling COVID-19. When you look at New Zealand and Australia, the reason why they've been so successful is because they had a national strategic plan that was based on science and the information that we were receiving from China early on. They implemented national efforts and guidelines and protocols, and the country was unified under those protections and guidance measures that were put in place by the government. There was no one saying, you're trampling on my freedoms or you're taking away my right to eat in my favorite restaurant. The entire country said, oh, our government said that this is what we should do, so we're going to do it. And so that made a huge difference in their ability to get to a level of zero and get back to some semblance of normalcy in their everyday life. And, you know, for us to get to the point where we won't see it in the US, it's going to be a while. I mean, we have to first get at least 70% of our own members in the US vaccinated, but it doesn't help just to vaccinate the US. We have to get 70% of everyone in the world vaccinated. Because if we have everyone vaccinated in the US and someone comes from a different country and brings COVID with them, well, then for those people who are immune compromised, whose immune systems don't respond as robustly to the vaccine, they have some protection, but not, you know, as much as they would like, then they are at risk for getting COVID again. And we may see COVID start to spread again. Also, there is a very large contingency of non-supporters of vaccines in general. And so those people, no matter what you say to them or what information you give them, you will not be able to change their minds about vaccines. And so with that in mind, we know that there will be a contingency of US citizens that don't receive the vaccine, and that will continue to place us at risk for having spread of vaccine. I mean, the measles outbreaks that we've had over the last few years, that is because people have decided to stop vaccinating their children. And so it goes from one person to the next. And, you know, the one thing that came out of that is that we realized that the measles vaccine waned over time, which we were not aware of. And so we're able to give people boosters to boost their immune system again. But because we have that small amount of people who will never get vaccinated, no matter what we say, there is always going to be the risk that we could see COVID in our country.
Do you anticipate that there will be a similar long-term impact of the vaccine where we may need to have people get vaccinated again or have some type of booster to continue to boost their immunity from the virus?
You know, we don't know about that yet. That's one of the things that we weren't able to determine because in a vaccine trial, because it takes so long to bring it to market, several years, we're able to see how long that immunity will last. We're not able to do that with this vaccine because it came to market before we could determine that, but they will continue to watch and monitor people over the next few years. Just because we get the vaccine does not mean that the studies stop. They don't stop, they continue. They will continue to monitor people. People who participated in the trials and received the vaccine will continue to be studied and monitored and have, you know, their antibody levels measured to see how long their immunity lasts from the vaccine. And fortunately, we're able to get a nice demographic of people participating in the vaccine trials. And so you have people with and without some of the comorbidities that are associated with severe illness. So we'll be able to see, you know, if you have an immune suppression disease, do your antibodies last, you know, for a year, 2 years, 3 years? You know, if you're healthy, do they last longer? And we'll be able to determine that over the next few years as we continue to monitor people.
Absolutely. Georgia, you recently did a story about some of the rollbacks that are happening within the state of Minnesota as it relates to restrictions related to COVID-19. What has your experience been as a parent, you know, and concerned citizen, but also as a journalist when it comes to the representation of COVID and its impacts on the Black community?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, what I've heard is just the skepticism and the mistrust. And I think that it's valid. I think when you look at the history in this nation and the distrust that is there, I think that they're, you know, interconnected. Even looking back to what happened with Black women, you know, who were slaves that were experimented on. in order to lay the foundation of what we now know as OBGYN practices. And so as a parent, just to be, frank, yeah, I have personal skepticism about it as well. And other parents who I've reached out to in our community share the same feeling. And so I think that what a lot of people are planning to do is to continue to social distance, to continue to wear their mask and wait it out, and maybe not get the first round of vaccines, but give it a little bit of time. And when the market really starts to open back up, then look at what the options are. And so, I think the biggest thing is that we know that social distancing works. We know that wearing your mask can mitigate the exposure and the risk. And so I think for people who have concerns and skepticism, I think sometimes we can feel gaslit when it's like, oh no, look at the science. Well, it's like, yeah, well, look at the history too. And so I think that in our community, we need to continue to assure folks that their concerns are valid and they're rooted in facts of what has happened historically in our nation with Western medicine and the Black community. But I also think that we need to look at the facts of this virus and that it has hit our community particularly hard, disproportionately. And so while folks are continuing to learn more about this vaccine, and while folks are waiting it out to see exactly what happens, I think that it's important that we keep our children safe, that we keep our elders safe, and that we keep ourselves safe by continuing to social distance and, wearing our mask when we go out.
Absolutely. You mentioned the history of obstetrics and gynecology and how its practices were created based on the experimentation and exploitation of enslaved women of African descent, and how that has led to the studies that we now know today and as women experience today, right? When we go to the doctors. And so there are very, very real negative concerns and very real historical implications as it relates to public health, especially as a person of African descent within this country. And I think one of the most important things that we can do as community members, as storytellers, as journalists, is continue to just open the door to the conversation, elevate the narrative of those who consider themselves skeptics, as well as those who feel like they trust where modern medicine is today and the systems and the practices that are there today. The conversations matter. And to your point about historical gaslighting, I think it is incredibly important that we don't discount our history within this country, that we don't allow it to prevent us from moving forward, but that we bring folks with us into the conversation instead of excluding them, regardless of which side of the argument that they may fall on. Now, we're talking about COVID and public health, and the pandemic as a whole really shifted our personal lives. We went from being able to see our friends on a regular basis and going into work and commuting to suddenly remotely everything is happening. All of a sudden we're working in our homes and work-life balance, who even knows what that is in a 2020 world, right? And so as we adjust and we transition to the realities of the pandemic, as we experience the gut-wrenching realities of an uprising, especially happening within our backyard, we're also navigating still our own very personal challenges and professional transitions and complications, which made this year so incredibly challenging, because it's like you just can't get a break from everything. It seems like everything is so compound. And many of you on this call experience some pretty major transitions in your personal and professional life. So I want to ask you, Georgia, you started out working for an organization doing media work and now are fully independent as a journalist. Can you speak to what that transition was like in the midst of all the things and what you're now learning as an independent journalist?
Yeah, I mean, I think, having that type of a transition during a pandemic is a little unnerving, because it's so uncertain. The market is uncertain. And, my husband and I have continued to just have to pivot because, at that time I was like, oh, we'll be fine because he has his own business and he has flexibility. But then his business had to shut down. And so right when we thought we were getting into a new rhythm, then we had to pivot again. And so, yeah, my transition out of working for a media entity was really enlightening. I think that the timing of it really helped me realize a greater purpose within the media industry as a Black independent, biracial independent journalist. You know, there are a lot of things with media that need to change. Since the inception of media, Black people have been misrepresented, you know, going all the way back to blackface, you know, even looking at newscasts that are saturated with Black mugshots. And so there is a lot of work to be done. And so I think that for me, I decided to really, really lean in on being an independent journalist at this moment and embrace all of the freedom that comes with my ability to now work towards changing the narrative of our community. A narrative that deeply needs to be reconciled. Yes, we need narrative justice. And so, you know, after George Floyd, I just saw so many people in our community that were kind of asking themselves, what can I do? And hearing some people saying, well, you know, hey, I'm an IT person. There's nothing that I can do. And, you know, being a journalist, you are challenged to hold up this integrity of being biased and objective. But when you realize that these media entities are centered in white narratives, who does objectivity serve? And when the practices continue to portray our people to be criminals and sweep under the rug the abusive past of white police officers, you know, you start to ask yourself, if you have the freedom to, as an independent journalist, I do, you know, who does objectivity serve? And so, yeah, so this transition, back to your question, Brittany, it was a little rocky to begin with, in trying to figure out, you know, how do I fund this work? What business model can I set up so that I can sustain myself? Because I'm a mother of 3 children. And every time I leave my house to cover a story, it costs me. So, you know, it was rocky at first, but I think that in this moment, there are so many organizations that see the power of media and see the need for this work, that a lot of advocates and leaders and organizations have gotten behind me doing this work. And so it's a blessing, but there's so much work to do. And I think that being independent has positioned me to be able to really aggressively go towards my objective of changing the narrative.
Now, can you speak to, when working at a media institution that isn't historically Black, or that doesn't necessarily lean into its journalists who represent different cultural backgrounds, what is it like to receive a directive covering a story that directly impacts a community of color or a marginalized community, when you're asked to cover it within a framework that differs from the way that you may actually see the story?
Yeah, I mean, it's demeaning and, you know, yeah, and I've experienced that, you know. I remember very vividly covering George Floyd, and there was a soundbite of a business owner who owns a business on Lake Street, who said, "You destroyed our community." And being the person who went out during a pandemic to get the interview, I knew the context of that soundbite. And what that business owner was saying was, "You destroyed our community," meaning the people who rioted and set the buildings on fire. But at that time, at that moment, the specific project we were working on, when that soundbite aired, there was a photo of 2 white cops and 2 Black protesters. And so I received a directive to remove that image, which is fine. Just remove the image, right? But when you receive that directive from a white individual who then gives you context as to why they want to change it, and that context is, those white officers were not the people who destroyed the community, and we don't want to misrepresent them and make them, you know, portray them to be responsible. So then now the motive for why we're making edits and revisions is to protect the identity of white officers. But then really in context, you really start to think about it, well, wait, the person who made this remark was actually talking about the protesters. So shouldn't we be doing this to protect their identity? Because we don't know if they actually did it. And so then, as a professional, you want to kind of just say, oh yeah, sure, I can do whatever you need me to do. But as a human being and as a community member, it just doesn't sit right. And so that happens in newsrooms all across the country far too often. And not every newsroom is like that. But I mean, I've covered officer involved shootings. And when I get into the newsroom, the first thing that I'm asked to do is to go find the criminal history of the person who was shot. That is the process. And so you can try to make it a part of your own personal process as a journalist to also say, well, I'm going to go and get the complaints that have been filed against the officer who was involved too. But at the end of the day, the editors, the news directors, the assistant news directors, and the general manager all have the power and the authority to omit whatever they want from your story. And so then you, as a reporter, for me, I was working in television broadcast, you become the face of that. And then in print, if your name is on the byline, you become the author of these reports. And so I think that we have so many Black journalists and Black media makers who sometimes are shunned within our community because of these things. And we don't even know behind closed doors the fights that they're fighting and the sacrifices that they're making. When I reflect on why I got let go as a news anchor and the timing of it matched up with when my report about the chief of police came out. 2 weeks later, I'm fired. I don't have a job. And so I think that there are a lot of media makers, a lot of Black journalists who are making sacrifices behind the scenes to try to change this system that we don't even know about, And so, thank you for asking that question. And I just want to encourage people to continue to stand with the journalists who are trying to tell our stories, because we don't know the fight that they're fighting within the four walls to continue amplifying us in a positive light.
You're absolutely right. And someone else who's doing that work to make sure that there is equitable and diverse representation within their respective media entity is Kendall Harkness, who's now joining us. Kendall is the Assistant Managing Editor of Diversity and Community at the Star Tribune. Welcome, Kendall. How are you?
I'm doing all right. Hanging in there. How's everyone?
We're glad to have you here. I know it has been an absolutely crazy year, an unprecedented year. And so to be a Black journalist has not been an easy task, never, right? But especially in the year 2020, as we're navigating a pandemic, an uprising that really was at the epicenter of our own backyards, and then our own personal and professional transitions. You also experienced a professional transition as you were promoted into this new role. So tell us about what it is that you're doing at the Star Tribune to make sure that there does continue to be representation of us at the table.
Wow. So I just started this new role. It's the Assistant Managing Editor of Diversity and Community at the Star Tribune. And it's only been 2 months, but the real work really started this summer after George Floyd's murder. As you guys probably are aware of, there was a reckoning that was happening at a lot of different newsrooms across the country. And so we had our own. And so we met with the publisher and the editor and basically spelled out for them how our organization through its 150 years has always centered whiteness. And what does that look like for the day-to-day person who's reporting, who's going out and being a photographer, a designer, a copy editor? What does that look like for each of those people? And we met in the park and had those conversations, and they were difficult. We wanted to see them in person because they needed to see us and to feel our presence so that they have an understanding of what it really meant. So it was good. I feel like they finally saw us in a way that they had not. And then this new role was created. So we put out a list of solutions, things that they could do to build the structures necessary to allow for us to feel like this is our place too. And so we've been starting the work. The reason why I'm late is because we just had our last department meeting. So we've been meeting we met with all the managers to try to get their minds right and around what they're doing as gatekeepers. And then we finally met with the last group of reporters and line editors, and basically mapped out what we're planning on doing. And it's going to take a minute to get to change 150 years of doing. This is not an easy task. It will not happen overnight. But the idea behind what we're trying to do is to build those structures. Basically, I want to be able to build a structure that allows for equity in a way that that is bankruptcy proof. So when these news organizations they start to lose money, I mean, we had that feeling in the 90s where like everything was great. We're gonna be a more diverse newsroom. We're gonna get training. And then all of a sudden that just totally fell off once we started losing money. And so my goal is to really build the structure into the walls of what we're doing, that it is a part of our everyday and that people are intentional. And we'll see what happens. We're right at the beginning of building structure. So I'm excited to see what happens. I feel hopeful in a sense that we can change this narrative a little bit, because the publisher and the editor say that this is a priority. So that's helpful. So, you never know how long this stuff is going to last. So, so we're going to do all the work we can now and move people now, and do what we can until we can't, right? So.
Absolutely. We have a question from the audience that asked whether or not it's possible to be a Black journalist and to be able to tell a story that accurately reflects the experience of your community within a historically white media institution, and to be able to have that story told without being filtered out and kind of watered down. I want to know what your perspective is on that. And if we're not there yet, how do journalists continue to move the marker forward?
Yeah, it's I think that we're getting there. So I mean, it's a real process. There's at every news organization, depending on how many folks are in the room, there is that whisper network, and so we rely on each other to, if there's a story that's coming out and you have a white editor and you're not quite sure if it feels like they're whitewashing your story, but you're not quite sure, then you have people to come to ask those questions. And now, with this role that I'm an at-large editor, so I just report to the editor. I don't report to anyone else. It gives people sort of an avenue to, now I just go and create opportunities for conversation. So like if reporter A has some issues, then I just call everybody into the room and say, like, let's look at this. Let's have a discussion about it, because it's a part of the, these white editors just don't know, right? Some of them are willfully ignorant, but some are just straight up just don't know. They have blind spots for a reason. They've only been able to see their own side of things for a long time. So part of it is just education. Like, no, this needs to stay in there for these reasons. This is more representative of the community for these reasons. If you say X, we're gonna get a bunch of phone calls. I mean, it's just gonna happen. So, it's about conversations and having those, and having the people in those roles be willing to listen. Is that going to be the case all the time at the Star Tribune or at any organization? No. There are going to be times where they can't see you or hear you because they don't have that same experience, or they're not willing to listen. But there's always somebody. There's always somebody who might be able to help in creating that space. But yeah, it is difficult. It can be done. It's not easy.
It's definitely not easy. And I think for some people, including myself, that's why they look to, can I tell stories through a Black media outlet so that I don't have to have those conversations and to translate and to question whether my lived experience and my journalistic integrity is going to be considered valid because it may have a slightly different framework than an editor or someone else who's managing my work. And so I want to ask Charles Hallman, what is the significance of being a journalist within a Black media institution?
Well, first of all, you have over almost 200 years of history, because the Black press has always been on the forefront of covering events or turning things around or those type of things when was not covered by the white media. First of all, Kendall, congratulations on your job. I've known her for a long time, and we need people like her in those positions because she knows that the media is probably the last bastion of diversity in terms of changing, and it's not easy to get people to change. But back to your original question, as a Black journalist, my job is to tell the story correct, not to get into this biased stuff or objective stuff, because that never asked a white journalist. Example is a longtime woman who covered the Supreme Court for National Public Radio was never asked about her friendship with Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Never asked about whether she was objective or not, and whether she had biases. She still covered the Supreme Court despite the fact she was friends. So why are Black journalists being asked to be objective? Because we cover the story that's Black, okay? We all have biases, we all have prejudices, and we have to know how to put that aside as a professional. But my job is to tell the story as best I can, as fair as I can, as accurately as I can. But we have to have Black people to want to read our stories. We have those challenges that we get it hung up into, well, I don't want to hear about news. That's too bad. I want to hear about the housewives of South Beach or something like that. I'd rather hear about that as opposed to hearing about what's going on in our community. We lost that years ago when we decided to flip from news on an hourly basis in Black media to, talking about other things. But that's a story for another day. But as a Black journalist, my job is to tell a story and do it as fairly as I possibly can and try to find something that's not being said normally or not being said in the mainstream press or even in other press. My competition is always everybody. It's not just Insight, it's not just North News, it's everybody. That's who I'm trying to, because somebody's going to read my story that may not read it anywhere else. So my job is to tell the story. Case in point, we talked more about the effect of the George Floyd. We never talked about the cause of George Floyd. We never went back and talked about the historical background. What happened, not even with Jamar Clark, but happened 20 years before that. I covered police shootings back in the 80s, okay? So the George Floyd wasn't the first, he shouldn't have been the patron saint of police brutality. There's been things going on forever in Minneapolis alone. I mean, that's amazing. People think Minneapolis, those things don't happen. So without rambling, my job as a Black journalist, and I'm proud of the fact that I work for a Black press, is that I tell the story the best I possibly can, and that people trust me and my community to tell their stories the best I can and truthfully as I can, not mistake-free, because we're gonna make mistakes, but that they trust that I will tell the story as fairly as possible, that they won't get that same shake, because at another operation, they gotta deal with a white editor, or have to deal with, they're gonna whitewash it, or that reporter gonna be hamstrung in being able to do those type of things. So it's still a challenge, but I got in this business many, many years ago because I love the challenge and I love to tell that story. So I'll do it until I have no more breath in my body.
Well, we absolutely appreciate your commitment to telling those stories that need to be told and standing your ground and being clear that you are, in fact, a qualified journalist and the narrative that you come with is one that needs to be shared with the public. So often, I think that Black journalists carry this weight and this responsibility that journalists who maybe look a little bit different don't actually have to carry, an additional burden of proof or an additional effort to almost legitimize in some ways the reception that they have from even members within their own community. And so I want to ask Harry, do you feel like the Black community fully embraces Black media outlets, or is there a disconnect in the types of outlets that we prioritize to put out public narrative?
I think we do fully embrace our outlets, but I think we overemphasize the mainstream media because it's what's more accessible. By that, I'm saying, so basically, let's just be real. Right now, we're doing this via Zoom, but it's being streamed on Facebook, and Facebook has in many ways become a gatekeeper. And so when people are getting their news through social media and Facebook, generally it's going to be the larger outlets that people continue to push and share. And it can be the same story, the story of Mayan Burrell coming out after 20 years. So you'll see the Star Tribune being pushed out, and then say inside of the Spokesman or North News, we have the same story, and ours is trickles out. And that frustrates me as a journalist to say, look, we're best equipped, real talk, to tell this story. Mm-hmm. We're more intimately involved. This isn't a drive-by story that we're telling here, because a lot of times I accuse larger media outlets of doing that, drive-by reporting, hop in, hop out. So that's what's frustrating to me, is that we are not doing taking the extra step to seek out the Black press in telling our story. But I do think that we are respected absolutely as members of the Black press. And I reflect back to when I was covering for Insight News, when I was covering the killing of Jamar Clark. It would be Charles, it would be Reg over at CCO, and it'd be me. And that was basically, and there's a brother from Minnesota Public Radio, but you had hundreds of journalists who descended on the town, and you had 4 Black reporters there. And when it got real, meaning when it was nighttime and when things were popping, it would be Charles, it would be Reg, it would be me. That was it. Everybody else was gone. They'd wait till it was 6 o'clock and they'd come back and set up the cameras to do their live shots. But we were the ones who were emotionally invested in this story and like, no, we're not leaving. Especially the night that the 5 brothers got killed, because got shot, because I remember being there and remember going through that. And it's like emotional even talking about it, because I just remember being there as a journalist, but I was being there as a Black man, experienced the same anger and angst that my brothers and sisters out there protesting were feeling.
You bring up a really important point about the emotional impact of being a Black journalist, especially when there is a story that hits so close to home. how have you all managed to hold your objectivity, of course, but also to still honor your humanity, to take care of your own mental and emotional health and well-being in a year where we're in a public health crisis, and in a year that our skin has become incredibly polarizing once again? How have you all managed that?
It's hard. I am so the day so George Floyd was killed on Memorial Day. That Tuesday, I got a call from the mayor's office saying that he wanted to sit down for an interview, and I was granted the interview along with Al McFarlane, Mr. Mack, as we affectionately call him, who is the founder of Insight News. And we did the interview, and it was carried by media outlets nationwide. And at the end of the interview, I mean, because we were being our professional selves as journalists, but at the end of the interview, it was just really hitting me. And I just broke down in tears as a journalist. And when they held Pillsbury United Communities organized a press conference at City Hall, and during that press conference, it was announced that Derek Chauvin was going to get charged. And like, I'm sitting there and I'm recording, but I got like tears running down my face because I'm going through the moment and the emotions. And I had a connection that all the other people with the camera stands and microphones, I don't feel had, and that I know they didn't have.
Does anyone else want to respond to that? How have you managed holding your humanity with your role as a journalist?
It's, again, it's just like Harry, it's hard because you're a Black man. And when all the things that happened, what happened to George Floyd, first thing came in my mind, I'm thinking about my two sons who are now adults, and they could have been there, or any number of young men that I've worked with and known over the years or in the community could have been there. So yeah, the anger, I was more angry than emotional. I won't say I cried, but I was more angry to the point where I would have to do something to still my anger. What would that be? I find a comedy movie to look at. I find a book to read just to make me laugh, because if I didn't, I would be angry. I'll throw something at the TV. I'll do something, because when you see that happening, and it happens all the time, it wasn't a one-time shot. That wasn't the first time a Black man got killed by a policeman, but it was just, it happens all the time. And when will it stop? I'm young enough to seen this happen. Even as a youngster growing up in Detroit, I've seen this happen so much. And so therefore, when will it happen? Will it happen will it happen in my lifetime? Will it happen in my granddaughter's lifetime? I don't know. So it is emotional, and it's hard to, as a journalist, you're going to be involved anyway. I can't speak for Harry, and I can't speak for Kendall. I know as a Black journalist, I get emotional on every story I cover, because if I want to get the truth, I'm going to have to show I'm human. I can't sit up there and be cold about it. I can't talk to somebody and ask them to speak to me about what happened, and act like, oh yeah, that's good. Thank you for that, and move on. That's that drive-by philosophy that Harry was referring to. I have to try to show some empathy and allow them to know that what they tell me, I'm going to use it in the best possible way. I'm not going to betray them in what they tell me. And I think that's the uniqueness I have as a Black journalist, or we have Black journalists, that we can talk to our people, we can cover a story, and they know that in some way or another, it's going to be told correctly. Where if they told that to a person that didn't look like them, that they don't know where that story is going to go. So yes, the emotion is still there. I'm still angry. I mean, that's not going to go away. I mean, how many Black people not angry? so it's going to always be there. It's just that how you challenge it, how you handle it. And like I said, I try to keep my anger in check. I pray a great deal. So therefore that helps me a lot. And luckily I had friends who checked on me during the the George Floyd incident, doing all those type of things, checked on me from around the country, calling on me, making sure that I was all right. Because again, we was in the epicenter of what was going on, all craziness that was happening at that time. They just want to make sure that I was all right, and I appreciate that. But yeah, it's not easy, and it's never going to be easy. So therefore, if I would say that, I'm not a human being anymore.
That's right. Well, I want to pivot back to Kendall and ask, the Star Tribune being a newspaper that's been around for a long time. We're now in a pandemic, and so there's an even larger consumption of digital media. And so I'm curious, as you're also talking about shifts in the way in which stories are told and the narratives that are centered, how are you also thinking about the mediums that news is delivered in and how to stay relevant in what we're seeing as a really large boom in digital media?
Yeah, I think for the Star Tribune, we've been doing a lot of sort of bolstering up our digital platform and how we do things and how we do social. We're hiring people for that to do a better job with that. There's one particular person in our digital team, Alexis, who has been really sort of using Facebook and Instagram and trying to drive traffic in that way. So, our goal is, I think we're also we just got a new front end system where we'll be putting stories and pictures into this new CMS that will be digital first. So we'll switch from having everybody input into a system that's print driven to inputting to a system that's digital driven and then shoots off into print. So so yeah, I think that's the piece that we know. A lot of media organizations after the first few months of the pandemic saw a huge advertising hit. And we were among those people who had that hit. But our goal all along has been to try to get more digital subscribers. And so that's the direction that we're headed to, and sort of trying to, shift what money we have sort of in that direction so that we can do that work. And it's been interesting, like Instagram has come up. It used to just be about pretty pictures. And now there's a lot of news that happens in that space. And it's driving a lot of traffic to us. So, we just try to put things on that people feel a connection to, or that have a good amount of information that's digestible for them, especially around COVID. Just making sure that if, like today, Governor Walz is going to be giving another press conference about what the new restrictions are, alleviating some of the restrictions. So that'll go up as an Instagram card. So yeah, just trying to be smart and diversify what we do so that we're nimble for the future.
Absolutely. I think it's incredibly important for media outlets to not make their historical traditions obsolete. I've heard people say print is dead, radio is dead. As somebody who's participated in both those mediums, I would beg to differ. I think they're both still very relevant, but the way in which people may be receiving some of that content may be on a platform that's relatively new. And I think that's the important distinction, is that you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak, but you do want to stay current with the times and embrace the new platforms that are available for storytelling and more creative delivery of news, and realizing that news may be delivered in ways and in platforms in which we haven't historically seen. And that doesn't make it any less relevant or any less important. It's just the reality of the way in which our world is shifting. And as I'm looking at time, I want to ask everyone one final question before we close with some COVID announcements and Miss Adrienne. So I want to ask all of the journalists, this year, we have lost so many brilliant icons within our community at large, everyone from Kobe Bryant and Chadwick Boseman to Debo from Friday just passed, Betty Wright, B. Smith, the list goes on and on and on. If anything that I can think of is that I've learned from 2020 that the only thing that's constant in this world is change. And we really have to hold on to the pillars in our community while we can, and push forward the narratives that matter while we can, because the world shifts so incredibly fast. And as we've seen in this year, it can shift in really, really drastic ways. My question for all of you as we close is, what is your hope for the future of media, and specifically for our representation as a Black community? And Kendall, I'll start with you.
What's my hope for the future? I just hope that we are, for our media, is that we just do a better job of seeing people where they are, and reflecting what we're seeing, and that we can do it in a healthy way that lifts people up. And have it be this complex look at who we are as Minnesotans, right? And what we do. Did I answer that?
Absolutely. Yes, you absolutely did. Charles, I'll go to you next. What do you hope for in terms of the future of media and our representation as a community?
I hope that our future in media will be that we'll continue to tell the story correctly and fully, using all vehicles. Obviously, I'm in print, but we definitely want digital to be involved. We want radio to still be involved. And that we'll continue to use, if we are in a racial awakening, as they claim, that we need to continue to push the envelope to to force people to see the importance of Black people, not as victims, but the contribution that we have provided in this country. We built this country from the day it started on the way today, that those accomplishments will be appreciated, not just for white people, but even for us as Black people, to know our history. It's not just slavery. It's before slavery and it's after slavery, but we have to, I'm hoping that we will be able to see ourselves not as victims, but as true people of this country, that we can build, we continue to build and continue to push the envelope and continue to push the powers that we are indeed worthy to be looked at and recognized as true citizens in this country.
Absolutely. Georgia, when we think about the future of independent media in particular, which is a space that you have been absolutely phenomenal in, what are you hoping for the future, and how do you want to see us represented?
Absolutely. Well, I would say, I hope in the future, the community can really get behind and rally behind independent outlets and Black-owned outlets. So when you see those stories come through from some of the corporate channels, go check out North News, go check out the Spokesman, check out the independent outlets and see if they're carrying the story, and share it. Like, just sharing can elevate these platforms so much more. Subscribe to them, advertise. If you own a business, advertise on these platforms, because that's the only way that they're going to be viable, right? I'd also say hold newsrooms accountable. I didn't become an independent journalist because I wanted to. I became an independent journalist because nobody would hire me in this market. I'm from here. And if I want to continue in my career field as far as television, I have to leave. My mentors remind me of that all the time. Hey, if you want to get back on TV, just leave. get out of Minnesota, but this is where I'm from. And so I don't want to take my talent and my gift into another community and build that community up. I want to do what I'm good at here. And so if it means that I have to be independent, then so be it. But the last thing I would say, Brittany, or what I hope for the future of media, the media industry at whole, is that there is a shift in ownership. And right now, the way that the industry is set up, it is standard that when you become an employee, you sign over all of the rights to your work. And I think that that is very exploitative. And so when you look at someone like Prince, who had to write slave on his forehead and change his name to get the world to understand the exploitation that was happening with artists and record labels. It is so parallel to what's happening in the media industry. The media makers, the journalists, the photographers, the reporters are on the front lines. They're going out, and right now they're going out in a pandemic to get video, to get photos, to get information. And guess what? At the end of the year, their earnings are capped at a salary, and they are signing over, they're waiving the copyright to all of the material. And so in the long run of what ends up happening is in 20 years, you have CBS, ABC, NBC, Fox, all of these huge corporations who retain copyright to all of that. They can make a documentary and make millions. And the person who went out and captured those videos and that photo won't see a dime. But they also have the power to press delete because it's very expensive to archive media. And so as we think about what will our children read in history books, what will they see in documentaries about what happened in this moment? If we don't fight to retain the ownership of our media, of our stories, then guess what? We're going to be back in the same exact situation where they control the narrative and they control what story is told about what really happened this year.
Excellent points, Georgia. Thank you. Harry, I'll go to you next. What are you hoping for as it relates to the future of media and our representation as a community?
I'm hoping you don't make me follow Georgia no more. That's what I'm first hoping.
It'll be the last time because this is the last question.
She's a superstar, and I am honored each and every time I get to hear her talk and see her work. I really believe that highly of her, and I'm excited for what she has going on. To echo her point, ownership and leadership, absolutely. Those are two of the key areas that I want to see the future of media when it comes to Black ownership and Black leadership. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing is something that I'm working on now through North Community High School, which is bringing along the next set of journalists. We need to be training the next group, because it can't start and stop with us. It didn't start with us. It certainly can't stop with us. We need to be at the forefront of the training of our young journalists and getting them excited about telling stories, getting them excited about news, and whether their passion is in sports news or entertainment news or political news or theater or whatever it is. But we need to get them excited about possible careers in this profession, because you go back to the griots of the old, we are the storytellers. We're the ones who keep our legacy and history alive. And so that's where my hope for media.
Well, my hope is that all of you will continue doing what you've been doing. You all have been incredibly instrumental in shaping the narrative of our experience for a very long time. Harry, you so graciously passed the baton to me for me to even be in this seat. Georgia and I are getting to collaborate in some really exciting ways. The first story that I was ever featured in within the Star Tribune, Kendall was actually one of the photojournalists behind it. And that was incredibly validating to see a young Black leader's work uplifted through a newspaper who I didn't think even saw us, and Mr. Hallman, who's been doing this for so long, the work that you you all do, it really does matter. And so we just want to give you your roses and say thank you for the ways in which you showed up for our community. Black journalists do in fact matter, and the work that you do does matter, and it does make a difference. I want to end with Miss Adrian Thornton. Adrian, we only have a minute left, but I do want to ask you, what is your hope when it comes to media representation and the pandemic? Because you're the one that's in the lab, you're the one that's in the hospital, you see what's happening in real time. What's your hope for the way in which our healthcare is represented in moving forward in the media?
You know, my hope is that going forward that we start to tell more of our stories. You know, we're starting to see some of that now. But for instance, I did not know that one of the physicians that helped to create the COVID vaccine was a Black woman. If this came out so far after we had the vaccine conversations, this could have changed a lot of our conversations in our community had we known that, you know, months and months ago. So I just hope that we're able to tap more into our medical professionals and tell their stories and get that out there so that the community understands what we're dealing with, how we're managing it. And, you know, when you see the faces of those frontline workers who are the heroes, that is not a whitewash, because there are a lot of us that are on the front lines doing the work. And so we just have to get more of our stories out there. We have to talk about them. We have to tell people about them. And we have to show our community that we're engaged and we're involved just as much as anyone else.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for your service and your commitment to this town hall and to the community at large. And thank you to all of the frontline workers for your service. We're going to wrap up this conversation by first and foremost saying thank you to everyone who's been watching this conversation. This will be our last town hall of 2020, but we'll be back January 13th, 2021. And we'll be talking more about COVID-19 and the vaccine and our experience with navigating this public health crisis. Thank you to everyone who's been watching this town hall. It's because of the pandemic and because of the issues that our community faced in this very unique and unprecedented year that we even had the opportunity to create this new platform. And we're going to continue bringing forward the stories that matter. So thank you for engaging with us and watching. And we hope that we see you within the new year. My name is Brittany L. Wright with Insight News. And until next time, happy holidays, and we'll see you soon. Take care, guys.